Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick. How is everyone going? Weekend before last, we had the X-Wing World Champion for 2019. And yes, I haven't forgotten. It's just taken me a bit of time to get to making this. We're going to take a look at the top 16 lists and also talk about a few other notable lists that made the cut. We had a cut of 128 players in this particular tournament. Not surprising, it's meant to be massive. It's the World Championship after all. And indeed, it's the first World Championship in X-Wing 2nd Edition. The last one we had was just towards the end, or like in the very beginning of 2nd Edition, so it was actually on 1st Edition, which was won by Brobots. This year, we now have 7 factions in the game, and I just want to give a couple of quick shouts before we get into these. First of all, to FFG themselves. If we take a look at the raw stats of this stuff, it seems like the meta is going quite well. It just feels really great and diverse, and I have to give you guys a thumbs up. I think they're doing a terrific job. The key things that I look for when I want to talk about X-Wing having a diverse meta is A, we're getting general representation of all factions, and within each faction we have a bit of diversity. Now, I would argue that I think there could be a little bit more diversity within the factions, but the fact that we're seeing play from all of them alone is a great indication for the game, so well done to FFG. Also to the Scum and Villainy podcast for hosting both Metalwing and List Fortress. 2 resources without I wouldn't be able to make these videos. These are seriously important, and they are completely run and supported by the community, and it's because of these we're able to take a look at the stats of each individual ship, upgrade, pilot. We can see the actual results from all the tournaments, what lists were flown, all that kind of stuff. It's just massive, and basically what I'm doing here in this video is relaying information and discussing it from those 2 platforms. And I just want to implore anyone from FFG, if you're watching, please consider making some kind of official resource like this. It still baffles me that we have a large tournament like the Worlds that were directly presided over by FFG, and this is the way we get our information. We have to go through a third party that has sort of community input just to see what the results are. Doesn't really make sense to me. I really feel like on the X-Wing website, it would be great if we could have, under all those tabs, like list building, all that kind of stuff, we could have one for tournament results. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me why we don't have that just yet, but hopefully that is something that FFG will be looking at soon. Fingers crossed. Anyway, let's take a look at actually what happened in this tournament. Now, in previous MetaWatch videos, I've spoken about a lot of different stats like size of ships, size of squads, that kind of stuff. And I've actually decided not to do that anymore, mainly because we now have 7 factions in the game and we have certain list archetypes which are really throwing those numbers out. The big one being Vulture Swarms. It basically throws out all the numbers with ship sizes and squad sizes. So I'm not going to look at that anymore. Instead, I'm going to have a look at more lists that made the cut in each tournament and sort of discuss the archetypes of each faction a bit more in depth. I think that's a bit more of an important thing to discuss. But I will still check on the faction representation of all of these. We're going to have a look at the top 16 lists within this particular tournament. And within this tournament, we had a pretty even spread of the factions. The only 2 notable things is we had a slightly higher representation of Scum lists, in they had 4. And we had no FO list in the top 16, which to me, I don't really think is highly indicative of any trend. If we take a look at the Scum list being flown, it's pretty much what we've been seeing, apart from a bit of an anomaly. And in terms of the FO, in fact, let's take a look at this list here, which is Kylo, Quickdraw, and Lieutenant Tavson, which was represented several times in the top 128, the cut on day 2, just not in the top 16. And look, this is pretty indicative of what the FO has been doing, just slamming as much as good stuff as possible. Having the shuttle as more of a support role is good. It means it's probably doing what FFG designed for it to do. But there is discussion around this. Perhaps FFG do need to have a look, particularly at Quickdraw, which is basically flown in almost every FO list. Whether the points have to be adjusted there. It does seem like the faction tends to gravitate towards these things, but do remember that the faction is getting a new ship. It's going to be another ace platform in the next wave, so I imagine FFG want to have a look and see how that affects the meta before they make any decisions on that. Okay, let's have a look at all the other factions that were flown in the top 16, starting off with the Rebellion. And we have a bit of representation from the Z95 Headhunter, something that we haven't seen much of up until this point. Also here a strong showing from A-Wings and B-Wings and Wedge Antilles, which is something we've seen since the start of 2nd edition. No real surprises here, just Rebel Beef at its best. Leia Organa still proving that she is completely viable, although at this point, 2 of the top 16 lists running Leia Organa I don't think is indicative that she wasn't raised in points enough. I think this is fine. I mean, this is nothing like what she was doing back when she was only 2 points, so... But yeah, this is pretty much what the Rebellion is doing right now. The beefy lists, I don't know if we can strictly call this Junkyard Rebels. I mean, this top list here, you might make that argument. You have a nice interaction with those pilot abilities. But essentially, it's about putting as much chunk on the table and making it difficult for your opponent to shoot through it, while you point as many guns at their highest priority targets as possible. Let's move over to the Republic. Again, this is pretty much a continuation of the kind of things that we've seen happen on this faction. Jedi Starfighters and Rico Lay dot lists is pretty much where they're at right now. Interesting to see some representation from Plo Koon. I have made the comment that I don't really like the costing of this pilot. He's only slightly cheaper than Obi-Wan Kenobi and way less powerful. But as you can see, he's being flown alongside Obi-Wan Kenobi. So maybe there's an argument that he offers good redundancy alongside Obi-Wan, which is fine. These 3 of Ace lists just seem really solid. Also, we did have representation of lists including the Torrent Fighter and the Arc 170. Both of those offer a good amount of chunk to put on your list alongside a Jedi. For example, this list here with 3 of the Arc 170s and Obi-Wan Kenobi, it just seems like a real solid strategy. Doesn't take away from what the Ace is doing. I don't really think either of these approaches are better or worse. It just comes down to playstyle. Also, yes, we did have representation of the new Y-Wing. Again, they're able to offer a lot of chunk onto the list. This is something that was flown, for example, here with Broadside and Matchstick with ion cannons. Pretty straightforward, a kind of fun approach. Also, Luminara and Wolf. Those are some fun pilots. Not exactly what I would have thought would be highly meta viable, but yeah, good to see these kind of things being flown and not just Jedi.list. Okay, let's move over to the Resistance, and this is pretty much Transport and A-Wings. These are the 2 lists that made the top 16. It's interesting, the A-Wing has already seen a points increase, but it's still very much the most played list on the faction. In fact, it's the most played ship overall. If you take a look at MetaWing, it was the highest represented ship in the tournament, or at least in the cut. It's a bit hard to tell what the stats mean. By the way, if things are a little bit vague on MetaWing or anything like that, you have to remember it is all entered in by the community. There's also multiple different tournament inputs for the worlds, and not all of those completely match up, so just be aware of that. If I'm not entirely certain about any particular stat, that is why. Not that I'm criticizing MetaWing at all, it's just what they have to work with. This is awesome. We still have representation of Finn. I think this is good to see, honestly. Obviously, Finn was the best thing on the Resistance for a short while because of that weird rules interaction which didn't quite work. That defensive strain just offering no downside. And look, it was a bit silly. FFG fixed that, and I think we have to appreciate that Finn is still a great pilot. It's still a great versatile ability. And I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see him see a lot of play. He's the most expensive transport pod pilot, but I don't think that makes him unplayable, not by a long stretch anyway. Also, we did have a few lists that ran the Falcon on the Resistance, something that we haven't seen a whole heap of. But you can see with lists like this, with Rey, Poe, and Greer Sonnel, something which I really want to try myself, you can sort of fit enough chunk on the list to sort of justify it. Also, I gotta say, I really dig this basic build with Core Seller and Rey's Millennium Falcon. It gives Rey a very strong action economy. She doesn't really need a whole heap of upgrades to make her ability work. It just seems nice and straightforward, and something just seems to make a lot of sense on that platform, so that's cool to see. Okay, let's move over to the Scum faction, and we've got a bit of a discussion to have here. First of all, before anything else, yep, Torquemux.combo was something that was flown. There is a 2 of here. I am curious to see what FFG thinks of this and if they're going to do anything about it. Obviously, like these sort of all-in combo builds can lead to what is arguably negative play experience, and I wouldn't be surprised if FFG tried to target this in the next points change. The difficult thing is how exactly are we going to do that? What sort of ship do we want to affect? I don't think we want to raise the cost of Kiraz fighters. That doesn't seem desirable. That ship really doesn't see play outside this list. I think it's going to have to be to Torquil Mux himself, if anything. Also cool to see Tirani Cola. That's a nice bit of spice to add to this list. But also, we had a couple of interesting things here. Okay, the Black Sun Assassin ×4 list. And I will just briefly address the controversy surrounding this list. I'm aware of what happened in a previous tournament where we're talking about fortressing and people potentially abusing the rules and contentious judge decisions. Now, I'm not going to repeat what happened on this channel. I frankly don't have any interest in negativity and drama. It doesn't interest me whatsoever. Suffice to say, the reaction from the community, despite how you fall on this issue, was quite toxic and just frankly disappointing. And I just want to voice my opinion that, yeah, I don't necessarily fall one way or the other on this issue, but come on, we're better than this as an X-Wing community. But in terms of fortressing and whether or not we think this kind of thing's okay, this is something that X-Wing players have discussed all the way since back in first edition. And I do want to actually talk on that topic, leaving the incident aside, and get your thoughts on this. What do you all think of this kind of strategy? Do you think it's just a bad thing for the game? Do you think, oh, well, it's part of the rules, it's okay? What I'm referring to, fortressing in general, and this is something that the Star Viper currently is uniquely positioned to do because of that curved barrel roll, is basically not moving your ships as much as possible and not committing to any kind of formation or maneuvers in the early game to force your opponent to make the first move. Because Star Vipers can do that curved barrel roll, they can sort of do all kinds of, like they can do like a one bank and curved barrel roll to just essentially move them sideways slightly, which means they're basically just doing this at the edge of the board and not committing to a maneuver. They can also bump each other really effectively, so they barely make any maneuvers. And obviously, yes, playing for time and all that kind of stuff is not something we like to see in X-Wing, but fortressing in general, like even if you're playing it at a good pace, it's still something that a lot of people frown upon, and I'm curious to see what you all think. My general attitude is it's something that is a part of the game. It's something that Pal Paces, to a certain extent, have done ever since their inception, and we've not really kicked up much of a stink about that. I know they don't do it to this extent. I'm not saying that Pal Paces is, toxic and bad for the game, not by any stretch of the imagination. And there was this list back in first edition which literally just stayed still the entire time, that used a Jump Master and a YV666, and basically your opponent had to fly at it and couldn't get out of like these really powerful firing arcs. That is an extreme which I think is actually a really bad thing for the game. But in terms of these Star Vipers, I actually am a bit on the fence about it. So again, I'd love to hear your thoughts. The other archetype that we had in the Scum faction was basically Torquil Mux combo Star Vipers, and this was these two ship builds, and this is something that kind of surprised me. Boba Fett and Fen Rao, a really fat Boba Fett list with Maul apart from anything else. Now, remember, Maul is now cheaper than the Han Solo Gunner card and offers Boba Fett a similar kind of upside as Han Solo used to. Basically, you get to change a focus result once every turn because of that Force token. That's basically the entire reason why Maul's there, which is kind of what Han was doing. It's that passive ability to change focus results, which is great with Boba Fett's rerolls. Yeah, but two ship builds. I honestly didn't pick this as something that would do quite well in the meta right now. I mean, I guess with Jedi Aces and Imperial Aces being such a big thing now, we're not so worried about so many guns on the table. It's just surprising. Also, something of note, Fen Rao and Guri was something that was flown in the cut in several different lists. Cool, not going to complain about that. At the start of second edition, we had a lot of people flying Boba Fett and Guri because you can really sort of chunk up the build on Guri, especially with the title and things like that. And I'm just curious, I'm not really fully aware why these things are doing as well as they are right now, and I'd love to hear people who have flown this, like in the comment section down below, what is so good about these lists, particularly right now. Okay, let's move over to the Separatists, and yeah, it's a Vulture Swarm, who'd have guessed it? This here pretty much is indicative of what the faction is doing right now. As many Vultures as possible and some kind of support chip. At the SOS here in Australia, we saw the winning list with Count Dooku. Here we have Captain Seer. Indeed, in terms of meta play, Captain Seer seems to be the more preferable option. Interesting, we have a whole heap of Separatist drones. That's a bit different. Usually we just have the trade fetty drones. In terms of what's going on in the meta, I don't really understand why Initiative 3 is so sought after. But look, I suppose the difference at the end of the day is you could have all trade fetty drones, maybe chuck in the DBS character that passes off calculate tokens, maybe chuck in one energy shell charges. Yeah, having them all Initiative 3, I guess, doesn't feel like much worse upside than those options. Especially in a universe where you might come up against a lot of Trade Federation drone lists yourself, or the Torque or Mux combo that has a lot of Initiative 2s in it. Might be a handy thing to be able to fly against those. Also, a new archetype in the Separatist faction. We're seeing a lot of this come up, like a 3 of Ace sort of build. I say that in inverted commas because Grievous and Shertek, I guess you could call them aces in a way. Maybe not so much Grievous, he's more of a brawler flanker. But Shertek, especially alongside Sun Fac, both within Snare. I mean, this looks very, very fragile, but there was a few of these in the cut, so it's absolutely something to look out for. And look, it's just absolutely going to hate on lists that don't outbid it and run Initiative 5s and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's really, really cool. And most importantly, very, very different from what the Separatists have been doing right now. So it's great to see a bit more diversity on that faction. Okay, and last but not least, let's have a look at the Empire. First of all, a couple of lists of note. We did have a few lists in the cut running Rear Admiral Shenru. Seems to be a popular choice. We had this one here with Sunterfell, but there was also examples of Rear Admiral Shenru alongside Whisper and Captain Oiken in another Decimator. Seems like a bit of a B tier list, which is cropping up here and there. I know we've discussed the Decimator here on the channel and why it's been struggling. Maybe FFG are just pushing it in the right direction, so that's great to see. Plenty of representation of the generic Inquisitors on the Empire as well. This is just an example of one that was flown alongside Vader, but there were other things alongside Aces and all that kind of stuff. Just slapping on extra Inquisitors with things like Foresight just seems to be a very solid strategy. But in terms of our top 16, here are the 3 lists that were flown, and this is pretty much indicative of what's going on in the Empire. There is a nice bit of diversity on this faction right now. The 3 of Aces or the 2 of Aces alongside the Lambda class shuttle. It's interesting. I'm actually working on a video discussing the history of Palp Aces for the channel. Hopefully that'll be out sometime over the next week. And this is pretty much what we're seeing in terms of the Lambda class shuttle. It either doesn't have any crew or it has things like Director Krennic. We're not seeing a lot of things like Palp or Force users on the shuttle anymore, which is a bit sad, but at the same time, I do like the fact that this platform is performing in such a way that you can just use those pilot abilities and it's enough upside to justify supporting Aces, that kind of thing. Yeah, Redline and Sunterfell, geez, this feels like the start of 2nd edition again. But that's okay. I actually think it's quite a good thing when FFG or a games company in general nerfs a certain game element like Redline and it still sees some meta play. I think it's a good indication that it just wasn't overdone. It was done in just the right way and we still get a nice bit of diversity with old meta stuff still being viable. But most importantly, this top list here was our winning list for Worlds 2019. Oliver Pocknell, if you're watching, congratulations, mate. Whisper, Grand Inquisitor, and Darth Vader. Great to see the Grand Inquisitor finally doing something. It's a pilot which I've rated quite heavily in my own evaluation, and yeah, it's basically been interesting because we've seen more generic Inquisitors more than anything else, but yeah, it's really good to see this here. Whisper still showing that she can put up some serious numbers. Passive Sensors, 5th Brother, great basic build. Also Passive Sensors on Vader. Now, I've previously made the comment that I don't particularly like this combo. However, I do have to concede the point that it made it into the top list at Worlds. Let's face the fact, Vader is Initiative 6, so the upside on Passive Sensors is quite diminished overall. It's generally something that offers more upside when you have a lower initiative ships, because Vader can take that action. But he usually does that at a point where he knows who he will and will not get a target lock on. But the amount of upside it offers clearly works, so I really can't question that too much more, can I? Also, afterburners. Look, these are just great basic things to chuck on this platform. I mean, I've spoken about this before. You can put things like hate on, but really, Vader can function at different costs and different combinations of upgrades. And it's great to see. He's a very awesome pilot. I have made the argument before that I do think that Vader, compared to a lot of other Initiative 6s, is perhaps a little bit undercosted, especially on my beloved Scum faction compared to something like Fen Rao. I don't really understand when you compare those costings, but whatever, maybe that's something FFG will address at some point. We do have to concede the fact that, yes, Vader is an iconic character, and I think FFG do give a little bit more leniency towards those than others, so I'll concede that point. Nevertheless, it's a really, really cool list, a very terrifying thing to fly against, not something that I generally like to see on the other side of the table. Well done again, Oliver. Victory well deserved. And thank you all so much for watching. I hope you like what I'm doing with these MetaWatch videos, focusing less on stats and more on lists. I think really, ultimately, that is the most important part of these videos and the most important part of what we're discussing. Stats are great, but all in all, I think the more practical thing to talk about is what you're actually going to see at the tables at your local game store and major tournaments. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more MetaWatch videos and discussions about the X-Wing meta at large. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter and Reddit. Please consider supporting my Patreon as well, and thank you so much to everyone that has already done so. Really, really appreciate it. It is a huge boon to what we do here on the channel. Really, in terms of getting this into being potentially a full-time job for me one day, it is the most important thing that we sort of get those numbers up. So again, thank you so much for all of that, and I'll catch you all in the next video.